Welcome to another video. The reason that I split these two up, even though they're all the post-war international economy, is because in a regular classroom setting, what we got to on the last video would have been one day's lecture, 150-minute, and then this would be the second one. So that's why I split it up like that. And we're just going to continue talking about it here. And we want to start by saying that there is an expansion of international trade after World War II, mostly in consumer products. This had existed. Consumer products were traded before the war, but it really explodes after the war. This consumer products, the trade in consumer products really collapsed during the Depression. A lot of places had raised tariffs for various reasons, but the nature of international trade does change after World War II. Before the war, most of the trade, about 2/3 of it, was basic oil or cotton or just sort of basic trade products. But then after the 1980s, for example, we get this explosion of consumer products, things like toasters and my favorite, microwaves. So those are the products being traded after the 1980s. And this is because of we get a liberalization of tariffs. And don't, when I say liberalization, don't think Republicans versus liberals or anything. Think of, freeing up of tariffs. The first one we're going to talk here is the GATT, G-A-T-T. That'll be the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. This dramatically lowers tariffs around the world. A number of countries sign on to it, mostly westernized first world countries, if you will. There's also another reason for the expansion of international trade is the improvement of transportation of goods through the use of standardized containers for the first time. So if you're thinking about the back of a semi-truck, for example, or if you see a railroad train going by, you notice that all the containers on top of the train are the same size. Well, there was a long time where there weren't standard sizes for these things. And once you standardize things, and in this case it's through an international agreement that they standardize the increments to about 20 feet, not about, to exactly 20 feet. So when you get these 20-foot increments, it standardizes these containers and makes trade an awful lot easier. So we want to say that this consumer revolution that it existed in places like the United States and Australia and Japan and Western Europe, it only expands to the rest of the world in the last quarter of the 20th century. So that means, 1970s-ish to the present. That's when it really starts expanding to the rest of the world. And this next map that I want to show you here it has to do with this. And I would like to say that it's a lot easier to participate in the international economy if you have electricity. And this map, the blue areas on this map indicates places with electricity by 2008, and the darker red areas or orange areas indicate places where electricity still isn't fully quite developed in these areas. So you see a lot of African regions. This country up here is Afghanistan. So this would be places like Burma or Thailand are struggling with it. North Korea struggles, of course. So, certain areas in the Western Hemisphere, it's pretty much just Haiti that's really having trouble participating in the international world because of their lack of electricity. But this goes along with the globalization of products, and we'll talk about that more in a slide here. But in order to participate in the consumer economy, you're not using toasters if you don't have electricity, for example. You're not using microwaves if you don't have electricity. So it's much more difficult for some of these places in sub-Saharan Africa and certain parts of Asia. Afghanistan's been kind of at war for most of its existence. So it's difficult to use those products if you don't have access to electricity. Now, like we wanted to mention, globalization does accelerate in the late 1980s, in the early 1990s, and this is mostly due to the breakdown of borders. We'll talk about the EU a little more extensively later on. So breaking down borders really does accelerate trade. There's also technological changes. Computers, cell phones, the internet are all becoming a thing. And now you might not even recognize these images here. Like that kind of looks like a computer, but it's really old. And these kind of look like cell phones, but they're a little out of date at this point. But these things, the internet especially, makes it easier for capital, in this case we mean money, to move instantaneously, and that helps break down some borders as well. We also have this reduced regulation by states of trade. And what we're talking about here is making trade easier across borders. Now, this one you might have heard of a lot of it in the news lately because Donald Trump has been talking about it a whole heck of a lot. Whether it's bad or good, that's up to you. But the North American Free Trade Agreements comes up in the early 1990s under President Bill Clinton. And this is one of the, I like to use this example because it represents the most populous free trade agreements in the entire world. So between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, which are the three main countries involved in the NAFTA agreements, these three countries represent the most populous sort of open border trade policy in the world. And that's not to suggest that people can move freely. I mean, you still need a driver's license or something to pass between borders, and they're still going to question you. But in terms of trade, this is quite a big deal in expanding trade in North America. When we're talking about that expansion of GATT, and to go back to this one, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, that's what we mean when we're talking about GATT. So we get the expansion of GATT and the creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995. The idea here is that world trade should be based on a free market, and hopefully that would lead to a drop in prices, which would theoretically increase prosperity. So it does increase trade and drop prices, but it doesn't increase prosperity in poor countries. So the expansion of GATT and the creation of this World Trade Organization does help out first world countries, places like the United States and Australia and Japan and Western Europe again, but it really struggles to help out people in poorer areas of the world. And we have some examples here. So these would be the growth of exports in the developing world. So we're talking about Latin America. So there is a bit of a growth here, but it remains relatively stagnant over that time period. Same with in Africa, kind of a relatively stagnant. We'll talk about why Africa struggles, and Latin America will have our own weeks dedicated to those two regions. The Middle East, there's a bit of a dip between 1990 and 1995, but they've been slowly climbing up. Where it really is happening is up in Asia. You can see that Asia is really expanding. This goes along because this includes China and India, which are two of the developing nations through the latter half of the 20th century, which really benefit from the growth of trade. So China and India, among others, but those two especially, really get involved. And so here's just a map of the world with depicting World Trade Organization members and non-members. So just to kind of point some of the stuff out, places that are grayed out, Somalia and Eritrea, they're struggling. Those are struggling countries. We'll talk about Somalia a little bit later on. But for the most part, a lot of these nations are members and observers. It's just slightly different. You know, they participate, just not quite as extensively. And this is just showing you sort of the exports and the imports, the total percentages of the economy. I think this is a nice map that just brings it all together. So in this era of globalization, we want to look at two kind of broad views of globalization, and here they are. So on the one hand, we have this view that says that globalization leads to a borderless society that reduces the influence of the nation states. When we're talking about nation state, that means the countries. It reduces the influence of countries in general. For example, Great Britain isn't as powerful being Great Britain without trading, because the trade is what makes them prosperous. So this new borderless society reduces their influence as a nation, the nation of Great Britain. But on the other hand, we also have this idea that growing international inequality with the potential for a deepening international anarchy, including environmental degradation. So when we're talking about growing international equality, I'm going to sound a little bit like, I don't want to say what I'm going to sound like, but rich people are getting richer in this borderless society, this globalization society, while poor people are getting poorer. And that doesn't mean as a whole. I want to stress that being poor in the United States is a lot different than being poor somewhere like Bangladesh, where they struggle to participate in the international economy. So when we're talking about the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, we're talking about the first world versus the third world. Again, and I don't like those monikers necessarily, but that's what we're going to go with. And this environmental degradation part is with growing business and, I guess, deregulation, the environment suffers to some degree. And it's not a political issue because it's just how it kind of is. We'll talk a little bit here about environmental issues in a second. But especially when we're talking about this environmental degradation, we got to think about places like China and India, and it's changed a lot in the last few years. But in sort of the growing globalization time frame, India and China just really didn't care about the environment at all. Not that everybody in the United States does or everybody in Russia does, but China and India really struggle to coexist with the environment. And the example I point you to is China in Beijing. And if you ever see Beijing in the news, it's usually because there's a smog problem, because you can't go outside in Beijing without wearing a face mask on certain days just because of the amount of smog in the air. And they've made strides recently to try and combat that, but still, we associate environmental degradation, at least I do, a lot with China. Not to say that they're not trying these days. But we also want to say that globalization is not new. Since the Industrial Revolution, pretty much, globalization has been, people have been working on globalization. But by the 80s and the 90s, this globalization is really different in scope and scale, and that is to say that it is huge now. It's exploded. And it's really tough to put that into words. But we should also say that globalization isn't truly global, because there are some marginalized poor states, both within individual states, meaning inside places, for example, the United States, where we can think of certain states don't benefit as much as others from this new globalization. California does well, for example, while Iowa, that doesn't really produce much besides farm goods, doesn't really participate as much in the globalization. Not to say that there's anything wrong with Iowa. And also talked about marginalized within the global economy. Places like Bangladesh, for example, like we just talked about, struggle to participate in the globalized economy because they just don't produce enough, and they're not getting richer with this new globalization. They're actually staying pretty poor. We also want to talk about the globalization of culture. Now, since the time of the British Empire, Great Britain had been sort of the big deal in the world trade economy. So English was established from about the 18th century as sort of an international language. And the British Empire starts this, and then the United States coming in with the dominant hegemony really follows up with that. So English is this world dominant language. And I think this international language of trade really helps explain how trade is easier. Is when everybody's speaking the same language, it's easier to participate in trade. And since I think most of our native language is our English, we're able to participate in this a lot easier than certain other places. And I'll just come back to some of these places that are struggling with the new globalization. Highlighted here are some heavily indebted poorer countries, and they're indebted to other places because they import a lot more than they export. And you can see it's a lot of places in Africa. There's some over here, Vietnam and Laos and Myanmar struggle in Asia. Certain countries in South America are struggling too. So it's not good for everybody. I have a couple political cartoons here that might help illustrate that. So this one on the left. So this is representing corporate America. So there's some backlash to this globalization, saying that workers, U.S. workers and workers abroad are struggling while corporate America gets bigger. And I hope that's not a political issue, but sometimes it becomes one. And on this side we have, so here's the great society where everybody is living well, but these problems are being swept under the rug, if you will. And we also want to return back to these environmental problems, because there are some problems that come out of this. Climate change is a thing. I hope I'm not shocking any worlds by saying that. And this climate change is in large part due to globalization. There are two main problems that emerge in the 1980s, CFCs and the ozone hole being one of them. CFCs end up replacing this toxic refrigeration thing in the 1920s, and people think that the problem is fixed. But the CFCs actually, this was a big deal when I was in elementary school. We had lectures about it all the time. So the CFCs replaced this old toxic refrigeration. But by the 1970s, scientists discovered that the ozone layer has a hole in it. And I have a short video from Futurama that should illustrate what's going on here, because this ozone hole lets in a lot more radiation than it should. So it's a problem, and it's being fixed today, CFCs I think are illegal to use. And when we're talking about CFCs, it's a very sciencey sounding name, but they're what you would find in an air canister to help with refrigeration and certain other things. There's also the problem of the greenhouse gas issue, and that's also, I think, illustrated best by Futurama. This is still a problem today. The United Nations has built a framework after this convention on climate change in 1992, and we also had the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto's in Japan, where there's this large conference to try and combat these issues, to curtail anthropogenic interference with the climate. But how do you do it really is the question here. And the Kyoto Protocol sets limits and targets for greenhouse gas emissions. The United States actually doesn't sign it because the United States doesn't usually want to regulate business if it can help it. So if we just want to put some numbers on it, in 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol is taking place, there are 6 billion tons of emissions happening worldwide. Today, it's about 10 billion tons. So the Kyoto Protocol, a lot of people are on board with it, but nobody really follows through with it. This is the kind of stuff Al Gore would have been talking about in Inconvenient Truth. So these are some of the problems of globalization. It's not to say that nobody's working on them today. These are just some of the emerging problems from globalization. And then here's the chart that I was shown when I was in elementary school about how or what the problems of climate change are. And I really hope the video that I'm about to show you, well, I'm not about to show, I mean, it's linked on here too. I hope that helps you understand it a little bit better. So I just want to say thanks, and I will see you on the China lecture.